Now, again, because some people have been scholars, they can get away with not documenting certain things because it's taken for granted in their own field. They don't have to document some things that are a given in their own field. But if you are writing to an everyday person, you had better make sure that you document the things that you say. And so it's very important to look inside a source and see if they use documentation. Now, some warnings associated with this. If you go inside and you see very few or no references, that can be a warning that someone has not done the necessary homework. If you see incomplete citations, if you see them just giving a title of a book with no page number, that can be very suspicious. It implies that they don't want you to find something inside that book, okay? They don't want you to go look it up for yourselves because they know if you do, you'll find out that they're not using it properly. If you see them using sources that are overwhelmingly old, now there's an exception to that. If they're doing a historical survey or something like that, that's okay. Or if they're doing something on ancient history, of course you use some ancient sources to document what you want to say. But if you're finding them using sources written in the 1850s to document something like the pagan copycat Christ myth, the idea that the story of Jesus was stolen from pagan gods, you will find that many of those people are using sources from the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And that's where they get their information. It's like they feel that scholarship stopped in 1873, mm-hmm. when obviously it didn't. Another good example, so much is said about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they're going to overturn Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1945. If you don't use some sources older than, that are more recent than 1950 about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're not covering the whole idea adequately. Because so much more has been written about it. And we're living in a golden age of scholarship and apologetics right now, where so much more is being discovered or rediscovered and applied in new ways. If you're not keeping up to date on these things, if you're continuing to use sources that were last read when Disco Duck was the big hit on the radio, then you are not doing a good job of dealing with your sources.
So credentials, sources, and what do you call, you speak of recommendations.
Recommendations as well. Now, this is a very important thing, especially these days, and publishers are becoming much more conscious of this. Very often, when a book is written by a scholar these days, they will go and seek out other scholars to review the manuscript, probably before it's published, and to make some kind of comment. You say, well, I recommend this book because they did a very good job, what have you. And they will print the recommendations on the back of the book. I'm conscious of this. For Shattering the Christ Myth, I sought out the recommendation of Lee Strobel, the Christian apologist. Okay, I had him give me his recommendation because people look at things like that. Now, if you can't get some endorsement like that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you should look at who they have endorsing their book and see who it is. These scholars like Ben Witherington and N.T. Wright will get other scholars of similar persuasion, but they will also get people of somewhat different persuasion as well to comment on their book. So what you're looking for is not only recommendations necessarily, but recommendations from a wide variety of sources of different ideologies, even people who might be considered your ideological enemy at times. Well, that's kind of rare. Like if you can get some leading atheists say, I don't agree with the conclusions here, but this is great. I think this is a good book. That's really unusual, but it can be done. On the other hand, what you want to look out for is people who get someone to recommend their book who are their editor or their daddy or their friend or what have you, or some nobody off the street, or someone who happened to like what they said. That's not going to be good enough. Another good place to look for recommendations is from professional review sources. I'll give you an example is the magazine Publishers Weekly. Now that's a review source by professional researchers, librarians like me, people who read the books and evaluate them as sources. That's a good thing to look for, but you got to watch out for the way people use these recommendations. I'll tell you an example. There was a book by a fellow named Robert Eisenman, which proposed this radical theory about James, the brother of Jesus. And on the back of the book, he had a quote from Kirkus Reviews, which is a major publishing review source. And it quoted two words. And two words were basically fascinating reading. Well, I went and looked up the review of Kirkus of that book. And yeah, it said it was fascinating reading. But then it went on to say, but it never gets very convincing. Isn't that kind of a selective use of that review, would you say?
A little bit.
Just a little bit selective. So, I don't imagine a lot of people are going to go check out reviews in Publishers Weekly But if you have some suspicions, if it seems like they've quoted selectively, just 2 words out of what is probably a longer review, you might be well served to check out what they're quoting and see if it's in context and see if there's more to it.
Well, you're president of Tecton Apologetics, and you are doing the work all day long. You are reviewing material. You do book reviews for Christian Research Institute. You are always engaged in assessing and evaluating. Are these the steps that you go through every time that you are reviewing a book or an article?
Oh, yeah, because I'm such a dork, you know. I love doing that stuff. This is the kind of thing I love to do. I love to go into the stacks and dig things out. Yeah, some people just hate doing homework. You know, they hate doing book reports. That's another reason why sources like Wikipedia are so popular these days, is because people want to get their answer in a can and be done with it. In contrast, I don't mind spending hours in a library plucking one book at a time off the shelf looking at it. I go to the seminary library near where I live, Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida, and I will take down a whole stack of commentaries at one time and put them on the table and then go looking through them for what I need. Librarians will give me a dirty look, and that'll be that.
Now, you mentioned next that there are subjective reasons why people tend to like certain sources or accept certain sources. What would those be?
Right. And I frame these in a negative sense. There are things they'll say when you, let's say if you try and bring up my book on any one of those subjects, or you try and bring up a book by a scholar like Ben Witherington, in many cases, because some of these skeptics and cynics cannot answer the arguments in these books, they don't have the knowledge or ability to answer, they've come up with these contrived excuses for saying, well, I'm not going to accept that because blank. And it's an absolutely ridiculous reason. So let's talk about some of these reasons that I've heard out there, okay? Number one favorite reason, that's a biased source. You ever heard that one before? Yeah. Oh, that's biased. You know, it's biased towards a point of view. Well, hello, the truth is a biased point of view. Because it is the truth. It is naturally biased towards the truth. Because that's what it is. And so saying that a source is biased is not an answer. It doesn't rebut anything in that source, and it doesn't give you any reason to reject that source. Now again, I do have a caution here. You know, we can say that, well, this book is published by some crazy publisher that does stuff on time travel and Atlantis and UFOs. That's not an argument by itself, but it is a warning signal to say, well, you know, we might need to give this book a much closer look because look where it's coming from. And you don't automatically reject something by an atheist because it's published by Prometheus Press, which is the lead atheist publisher. You don't reject something published by Ben Witherington just because it came from Fortress Press. You don't just do that. You need to justify that. But you can give it as something as a warning signal if it is a particularly disreputable publisher. So that's the bias reason. That's the most popular one. I think about 90% of what I hear comes from that.
Now let me interject. Yeah. I've actually heard people saying, well, you can't trust the records of the four Gospels because they're written by true believers. Well, on that basis, if we applied that to ancient history, then I don't think we could believe much of anything.
No, there's so many examples. Of course, I know one of the favorite examples is so much of the history of the Holocaust was written by Jews. You know, it's well worn to appeal to the Holocaust, but that's because it's a very good example. If you're going to play that game consistently of, well, it was written by people who had an interest in it, you are going to throw out a lot of ancient history, including the Annals of Tacitus, which is the most reliable ancient history according to the historians. Tacitus was a very biased individual. It's a huge complaint against him. He disliked so many different people, and he had a point of view to promote in his work, and yet he is still considered reliable enough to be trusted overall. In fact, the historians will say, yes, we know he's biased, but you know what? His scruples were such that he wouldn't report falsehoods despite his biases. It's like he might spin things a certain way, but you're still able to get the truth out of him. And so, you know, bias does not keep you from discerning truth in a source. It does give you caution in evaluating it, but that doesn't mean that it's reporting a falsehood, not at all. And so it's not a sufficient excuse.
So after bias,
the reason that I hear most often is the fallacious appeal to popularity. In other words, look at all those positive reviews on Amazon that this book has got. Or look at how, you know, my mom and your daddy like this book, or my friends like this book. It's a bestseller. It's a bestseller. Well, Mein Kampf was a bestseller in Germany at the time, to use once again one of those Nazi analogies.
That's right.
Just because a lot of people like it, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, you will see some of these Christ myth books, people giving them 5 stars on Amazon. Of course, you'll have people like me sticking 1-star reviews on them too, just to balance it out.